The Honourable Mr. President of the Pan-African Parliament, Honourable Vice Presidents, Honourable Members of Pan-African Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to present the 2017 draft budget of our Union. As I am meeting you for the first time this year, allow me to wish the honourable members a successful and fruitful legislative year, particularly in your respective countries. May I also convey greetings from Her Excellency Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, Chairperson of the Commission, who also wishes you successful deliberations during this current session. Exactly 1 year ago, I presented to this August House the 2016 budget of our Union, which at that time had gone through the Permanent Representative Committee. Although the budget was not presented in time for you because of mismatch of PAP and the PRC calendar, I thank you for the contributions you made towards its completion. It is now under implementation, albeit without the alternative sources of finance, which I hope that this time we will apply with effect to 2017 budget. Mr. President, now that a practice of engaging PAP has been established, we need to develop modalities for budget development process. This can be ingrained in the financial rules. You may wish to note that after today's presentation, the permanent representative will be considering the draft budget next week, and thereafter to the Executive Council, and finally to the Assembly in July in Kigali for adoption. Before presenting the 2017 budget estimates, let me highlight the socio-economic environment under which the budget has been drafted. During the last 12 months since we met here, important developments with significant bearing to the future well-being of our continent have taken place. These include, first, a drastic fall in commodity prices. In January 2016, oil prices fell to unprecedented low levels for more than 3 decades. Some have actually concluded that this particular cycle marks the end of the oil boom prices. Main causes for this fall were A, reduced imports by US, which, as you know, is a major consumer that has shifted to fracking technology, and secondly, reduced consumption by China, the world's second largest economy, due to the sluggish growth that has not been seen for the last quarter of a century. And of course, this has also compounded a downward trend in commodity prices and dampening the global economic outlook. The effects of these broad slowdowns is hurting African economies more than most, because China and other emerging markets have not only been major consumers of our primary products, but also have been significant sources of financing for the major infrastructure and other development projects that are now taking place in our continent. Commodity price crash is causing significant budget shortfalls for governments and weakening, of course, currencies in commodity exporting countries, currency pressure in oil exporting nations has been most pronounced. The second development was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. The Ebola outbreak in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, in which about 30,000 people were infected and about 12,000 fatalities were recorded, was contained in the last 12 months, thanks to the combined efforts of the affected countries, the African Union, and the international community. Through these joint efforts, the danger of Ebola spreading out of the rest of West Africa and even to the entire continent was halted. This, of course, was done at a heavy cost due to loss of life in the three countries and also some of the gallant medical volunteers. The Ebola outbreak tested our capacities and resolve to fight together as a continent. We should be proud that we emerged victorious. We, however, should never be caught napping again. Thus, the need to continue to strengthen our weak health services, including the establishment of the African Center for Disease Control. Funding for this program is provided for in the 2017 budget. We've learned a lot from this unfortunate incident. We must do more to invest in our people, especially in health provision and basic needs such as water, food security, infrastructure, including health, and especially those in remote areas. Our people being the most important resource, there is no excuse in having quick and adequate response, particularly for epidemics in the future. You as lawmakers have an opportunity to provide leadership in this regard and ensure that the necessary investments are made to revamp our health facilities in our respective countries. During the same period, the conflicts on our continent have been checked significantly, but of course not completely extinguished. We continue to face challenges in Somalia, in Eastern DRC, Mali is stabilizing, and so is Central Africa. Challenge of Boko Haram in Nigeria. Libya continues to face challenges of stability and, of course, some disturbances, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula. A serious matter of concern has been the spread of internal and cross-border terrorism links linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This calls for a major review in the traditional way of approach to internal security. It is now a new normal. We must deal with and stop this in their tracks. To implement our African peace and security architecture, particularly silencing guns by 2020, we need to invest in early warning and also in crisis management before they degenerate into armed conflict. We have been discussing, particularly on financing of AU peace missions with the UN to give us support for funding that is predictable, that is adequate, bearing in mind that 70% of these missions of the UN are in Africa. This exercise is ongoing. Unfortunately, some countries like China have already made some pledges to about $100 million US, and we hope that the rest of the UN Security Council will come on board for us to secure funding, and this, of course, will have a major impact on our budget. During this same period, we have also witnessed a major migration crisis. Unfortunately, this problem did not only continue, but in fact escalated during the past 12 months, bolstered by developments in Libya. Although several migrants managed to reach the European shores, the truth is we shall never know the number of those that perished in the Mediterranean Ocean or across the Sahara as they tried to take the long trip to Europe in search of better life. For a long time, Europe was unwilling to listen to us, particularly in searching for solutions for migrants and underdevelopment in particular. We believe that this has to be a comprehensive approach to development and not merely addressing the symptoms as Europe has tended to approach this matter. And one of the areas that we are looking at is transformation of our economies, and in particular, industrialization to provide jobs and also tackle poverty as the root cause of this migration. This crisis has also created another challenge for us, and which will impact on our budget too. Europe is now diverting resources from ODA to managing the European migrants. And thus, as you know, they now say expenditure on migrants is recorded as ODA. But of course, there is also a crisis in the Eurozone. This crisis is even getting more complicated in the face or in the wake of the referendum of the UK on their intention to stay or to exit from the European Union. As you know, Europe is one of our major markets, but also major development partner, and that impact translates directly to an impact to our economies. Mr. President, despite some progress on export diversification, the majority of African countries remain dependent on commodities, particularly extractives like oil, iron ore, and copper, for their economic growth. We must address this as a matter of urgency to overcome commodity export dependence. It is sad to know that on average, Africa only adds up to 15% of all our exports that we export. The rest, which amounts to 85%, is added outside Africa. Mr. President, the overall fear of an emerging market slowdown blinds and dampens investor confidence in African markets. A number of multinational firms reacting to the negative news emanating out of emerging markets are pulling their investments from capital markets, especially those in Africa. The MCSC African Index, measuring the equity market performance in Africa, dropped by 19% in 2015, significantly more than that of other frontier markets. Consequently, Africa's economic growth is slowing. The African average GDP growth dropped to 3.8% in 2015, with oil exporting countries hit slightly harder than this. This growth rate is far too low from the tipping point of what we have been anticipating of 7%, which is seen as the minimum growth rate for economic transformation. Africa's growth trajectory is moving, of course, in the right direction, with industry contributing 18% to growth as against 18% agriculture, transport 16%, and services 14%. Africa's more diversified economies, and particularly oil importers, including those of countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and others, actually stand to gain from low prices. But the challenge is the export markets. The same principle applies to import bills for food, and also, which is estimated by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, that as a continent, our import bill for food has risen to $8 billion. This is unsustainable for a continent so well blessed with climate and rich soils. Current IMF projections do suggest that a combination of factors, including normalization of economic conditions in emerging economies, an easing of China's slowdown, lifting of Iran sanctions, and spillover from developed economies' growth will lead to an economic rebound for emerging markets in the late 2016 and grow to an average of 5% until 2020. We must remain alert and sensitive, particularly to jobless youth and also job-rate growth that we have also been witnessing. Gender inequality, lack of structural transformation, slow pace of integration, low volumes of intra-African trade, weak national base for finance, and the development agenda. Mr. President, unfortunately, there are also homegrown problems. One major homegrown problem that the continent has witnessed, particularly in the last 12 months, is, of course, what has been revealed by Panama Papers, and that is corruption. If the Panama leaks are indeed true, then Africa is illegally exporting capital through illicit financial flows to the tune of $150 billion annually, which is more than that which we receive from ODA and foreign direct investment combined. The sectors most affected are oil and other extractive industries. This is mainly done through transfer pricing of commodities and also poorly negotiated mining and infrastructure contracts. We must stop this unacceptable hemorrhage of resources of our continent. One other challenge that is emerging, especially in the last 12 months too, is the debt stock. As we speak now, the average debt stock of the continent is about 37% of GDP. During this commodity crisis, this stock has risen by about 2%. Although this debt is manageable, the average, of course, can disguise. The danger is the sources of this funding and the terms under which this debt may be secured. A number of countries, of course, and this also shows maturity of our continent, have resort to Eurobonds and the rest, which is a good indicator. But we must also watch out, especially when we know the crisis we went through in the HIPIC initiative, which created a lot of challenge for countries that were heavily indebted, that we don't submerge again into that situation. On savings, currently as a continent, average savings about 22%. This is unfavorably measured against what we see in Asia, which is about 46%. This, of course, also translates to investment, which is low as compared to what we see in Asia and the rest. These low savings also are seen in low government revenue. And the low government revenue is, of course, because of what we have just talked about, the leakages, particularly through illicit financial flows, but also weak tax base, which is not able to harness as much resources domestically. This is important, particularly as we talk about financing our Agenda 2063. During the same period, we have witnessed a progressively worsening drought across Africa. Many countries are facing hydropower challenges, those that depend on hydropower, but also extending to even food production. This crisis reminds us of the climate change that is here and a challenge that is here to stay. We must, as a continent, of course, having least contributed to this climate change, develop adaptation measures in the new reality that we live for us. Otherwise, as Africa, we are entering a new and a very challenging phase, especially for the sector of agriculture. Lest, Mr. President, I'm accused of being Afro-pessimism, let me now turn to the positive development. That is the good news, despite the litany of challenges that I've just enumerated. Africa still remains the continent of promise. Africa is home to a large and growing population of young people. In 15 countries, half of the population is under 18 years old. In 3 countries, half are under 16 years old, while burgeoning youth populations present a challenge to governments to improve education, infrastructure. This population can be used positively as an opportunity for Africa, and especially down the road when we see by 2050, 25% of global workforce will be from Africa. And with the aging population in the rest of the world, particularly Europe and Asia, Africa is blessed to be in this situation. But it can also be a time bomb, and so is something that we must look at very closely. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, our agenda is still underutilized, but Africa has made giant leaps in the last few years. In the last summit that was held here in Johannesburg last year, the summit has developed what we call a gender scorecard to monitor and evaluate how gender mainstreaming is being managed in our various countries. We hope that Parliament will also take this, particularly in your respective national parliaments, to make sure that as a continent we use the more than 50% of our resource in order for our countries to have effective growth by using all our human resources. May I congratulate this Parliament because I gather that from the Bureau 5, this time round, our women folks are 3, which means 60%, and you have beaten the record of even the Commission, which now operates at 50%. An equally interesting development is the urbanization, which will increasingly yield economic growth. countries can begin to take advantage of the benefits of this agglomeration, particularly in the provisions of basics, as it is much easier to provide these basics under concentrated populations. But we must also watch, because many of our cities are also developing into urban shanty towns, and which could also harbor the poorest of the poor if we don't manage them properly. We are also seeing diversification of exports or products coming from Africa. We are seeing more intra-African trade, which has doubled actually in volume, in spite of the fact that when you look at the average intra-African trade staying the same, this must be seen against a phenomenal growth in global trade in the last few years. In this, we commend particularly some of the regional economic communities like East Africa, which has gone beyond trade liberalization to bring about easy movement of people across its territory. We also see this in West Africa, and we would encourage that many of our regional economic communities follow suit. We have also developed what we call an integration index to be able to monitor and assess regional integration at national and continental level. In this regard, one of the elements that we're pushing is issuance of an African passport. At the forthcoming summit, AU passport will be issued to our heads of state and government, the Executive Council, AU organs, and I want to believe that Pan-African members will also be traveling on African passport in the next few months. Mr. President, honorable members, we have to weather the emerging downtown by us focusing on our collective energy and collective strength. We must continue to unite our people. We must also continue to use more effectively the private sector. And we must continue to address the costly inefficiencies, increase diversification, and speed regional integration as Africa, if we have to take advantage of the tailwinds that the continent has enjoyed in the last decade. Mr. President, last year we launched our Agenda 2063 along with its first 10-year implementation plan, and which has got some flagship programs. This is now firmly in place, but the next phase is for us to domesticate our Agenda 2063 in our respective national development plans, but also embark on its implementation. The determination of our Agenda 2063 is to develop Africa, particularly transformation that will bring Africa to middle income status, majority of our countries by 2030, and of course, be fully integrated, prosperous, and a peaceful continent by 2063. We hope this can be achieved even much earlier, and I hope many of us seated in this room can live to see that integrated continent. Furthermore, Agenda 2063 provides us with a strategic framework that will guide the Union's interventions as it supports the development and integration aspirations of the continent. as members of Pan-African Parliament and also in your respective national parliaments, please, and I guess you have also been able to receive and interrogate Agenda 2063, take this message to your respective parliaments, especially in domestication and integration of our agenda in our national programs. We are fortunate that for the first time in a long time, our agenda is in line with the global agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, Africa has faced challenges in the past because many of our programs were either scorned or ignored, and others developed programs which they deemed fit for us. But this time, particularly under Sustainable Development Goals, Africa had a major impact through our common African position. And that's why, for the first time, the global and the continental agenda are aligned. Let us take advantage of these stars being aligned to push our agenda forward for the benefit and particularly eradication of poverty in our continent. Let me now turn to look at particular dynamics of the budget that is before you. Last year, our heads of state and government made a major decision that we must strive towards self-financing of our budget as much as possible. In that regard, our summit has made a commitment to move towards 100% of operational budget, 75% of program budget, and 25% of peace and security budget. The peace and security budget is that low because, after all, peace and security is the preserve of the United Nations Peace and Security Council. And therefore, we are only an agent of the UN Peace and Security Council. And for that, that's why we also want to contribute and be in charge, but also provide leadership in managing conflict in our continent. If we have to maintain this scenario, then it means we must look at how we finance this. One of the suggestions that was made, and which heads of state are still examining, is to levy areas such as airline tickets, hospitality or SMS, or any other system that member states may choose, because depending on Treasury, fiscus has proved quite a challenge. In this regard, member states have been grouped into three. There are 4 countries that contribute a total of 60% of the budget equally. And 10 countries contribute 25%, no, 6 countries contribute 25% of the budget, and the rest of the member states contribute. Now, there is a group also contributes, which is with income of less than 25%, contribute 1 to 4%, and the rest contributing 1% of the budget. It is reckoned that if we shift to alternative sources of financing, the Union will be able to bring, of course, the continental framework to the people, but also lighten the burden of Treasury while enlarging and expanding the base of revenue. In this regard, in June in 2014, a foundation of the private sector was registered in Mauritius and launched at the summit in January 2015. The foundation has commenced work to mobilize funding from private sector and other sources. This has actually attracted, even encouraged, our heads of state and government to establish what is now known as the Private Sector Forum. This forum will be meeting in Mauritius later this year with the heads of state, not just for financing of our development agenda, but also to discuss policy issues and encourage participation of our people so that this truly becomes a union of the African citizens. The African Union Commission has continued to work with sister organs on measures to ensure continuous improvement in order to improve operational efficiency and of the service sectors and benchmarks as a way of adopting best practices. The 2017 budget plan of the Union will be based on the 5 pillars, namely on enhancing and strengthening sustained accountability, driving performance and operational efficiency, pursue financial sustainable and viable union, and promoting and strengthening synergies with organs, regional economic communities, and stakeholders. As you know, and we announced this last year, we have now firmly adopted and are using the international practices, including IPSAS, and we have also put in place new financial rules and regulations, results-based management, and also put in place measures such as fraud and anti-corruption policy to ensure that as a union we lead in this area. Of course, this will be also pursued together with improving the areas of personnel management, which includes staff performance, training, and development. In fact, in our budget, we have also made a provision for what we call a homegrown African Union Academy to train and manage our own personnel. Mr. President, permit me, before I even go into the substance of my presentation, to update you on the changes that have occurred in the budget development process. The internal program and budget committee, which is chaired by the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission and includes heads of all organs among starters, has already met, and its outcome is what is being submitted to you. Thus, Pan-African Parliament is the first point of call after the internal budget committee. In line with the ongoing budget process of 2017 budget calendar, it is envisaged that these broad consultations will continue and that this presentation of today will be followed by consultations with the PRC, eventually with the Executive Council, and as we said earlier, the summit in July. Let me now turn to the budget performance of 2015 before highlighting the budget estimates for 2017. Of course, we cannot highlight the budget performance of 2016, which should be able to guide us, especially for the 2017, simply because We are not even in the middle of the year of implementation of budget 2016, so we don't have any record that can guide us from the performance of 2016. This is, of course, the dilemma we face in preparing a budget ahead of time. The overall budget performance for 2015 stood at 230,095,163, representing 51% of the approved budget. But when looked at the available budget, which was 446,874,076, the performance was slightly over 70%. Member states and partners provided funding up to a total of 67% of the approved budget. That is 110,116,755, whereas partners provided 192, 215, 836, respectively. The execution rate of available funds, as I said earlier on, was 70%, broken down into 77% of operational and 62% of program budgets, respectively. Now, for highlights of 2017 budget, it's as follows. Along with the budget document, you have also been failed, and I regret that you have also not been given the budget framework paper, some miscommunication challenge. Let me highlight the following. The 2017 is the final year of implementation of the Strategic Plan 2014-2017, prior to development of a new strategic plan, which will begin from 2018 to 2021 strategic plan, and which, of course, then will give us an opportunity to align the first 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063. In that, there are 12 flagship projects which have been identified and which have been also factored into the 2017 budget, with the launching of the Free Trade Area as one of the major flagship